The sentence was delivered the way a mater d declines a table, with a practiced smile and a velvet tone. "You're clearly brilliant," the white executive said, handing back the resume like an expensive menu he never planned to order. But culture fit matters here. This place eats people alive who don't quite land." There was a pause long enough for the implication to find oxygen. It did. It flared. Fit. A word that pretends to be about comfort and ends up making a cage. It didn't matter that Darius had spent months solving the company's case study so thoroughly the margins of his printouts were pocked with pencil dents. It didn't matter that he'd already designed a pilot that could have shaved millions off a logistics line others had accepted as immovable. The room smelled of leather and loyalty. The walls nodded. Somewhere between compliment and rejection, the truth arrived without a courier. The standard wasn't excellence. It was familiarity. On the train ride home, Darius watched his reflection shudder in the dark window as the city unscrolled platforms, pillars, and a parade of faces no boardroom ever seemed to see as their future. He had known this feeling before, but something in the way that executives said fit shifted the weight from shame to certainty. This wasn't a weather pattern. Someone had built this habit into the architecture. This is the story of what happened after the soft no. How a black engineer from Dayton learned to name the machinery grinding under a smiling rejection. How he built a career anyway, then came back with the authority to change the machinery. How fit became ad. How a gate became a welcome, and how the person once screened out became the one deciding how the screening works. It's a story about what it costs to be told to shrink and what it changes when one person refuses to. Before badges and business cards, before elevator banks and laminated mission statements, there was a kitchen table in a small house on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio. Saturday mornings began with a ritual. A cardboard box from a thrift store dumped onto that table motherboards. Cracked monitors, retired printers, the detritus of someone else's upgrades, and the slow, satisfying work of coaxing life from what had been discarded. Darius's father, an electrician with forearms mapped by old scars and new wisdom, taught him that current always tells the truth. You can't negotiate with whether a circuit is closed. You can only learn to read where it broke and fix it. His mother, a respiratory therapist who worked a patchwork of shifts that kept the house afloat, posted spelling lists and multiplication tables on the fridge with strips of masking tape. When she came home at dawn with fatigue tucked behind a smile, she told the kind of stories that make dignity a daily practice. Stories about patients you sit with even when the monitor says they're stable. Stories about colleagues who say no quietly to shortcuts. Stories about supervisors who think your softness is a liability until the day it saves a life. The house was a school without a bell. It taught that precision is a form of care, that a steady hand can change an outcome. That expertise matters most when no one is watching. On summer afternoons, with a box fan batting hot air around, Darius learned to translate mess into order how. The nervous system of a desktop was soldered into place. How the body of a radio could hum again if you believed it could dot at school, he grew into a reputation. The kid who could fix what was stubborn. The kid whose hands moved with a patience that made adults look twice. He set up the science fair exhibit. That kept tripping the breaker, then rewired it on the spot so no one would have to squint at posters in the dark. He learned calculus like a language he already spoke. He learned, too, the other dialects life demanded, the little joke to make. A clerk relax, the polite correction to ensure your name is pronounced, the careful smile that saves you energy you'd rather spend elsewhere. College offered a new map. Industrial engineering appealed because it mirrored the kitchen table's promise. Take a messy, human system and find the hinge that changes everything. He minored in economics because machines and markets talk to each other in ways that can hurt a person who only speaks one of those tongues. He learned how a line backs up when a single station doesn't trust the next one down. How a queue fails not because of volume, but because the feedback loop is lying. How a supply chain collapses when a spreadsheet tells a pretty story while the factory floor tells the real one. He also learned, immediately, that competence did not inoculate him against the precise, daily ache of being doubted. The professor, who handed back his exam highest score in the class, with eyebrows raised just high enough to make the A feel conditional. The internship coordinator, who tried to steer him toward field support when he'd earned a design role. The recruiter who said, "You're very articulate," with surprise, wearing a smile that asked him to accept a compliment that was not a compliment at all. During junior year, a classmate slid him a research paper that would become a compass. Economists had tested the effect of names on callbacks by sending out identical resumes, some with white-sounding names like Emily and Greg, others with black-sounding names like Lakeisha and Jamal. The results were a punch, a confirmation, the same credentials, the same experience, but the resumes with white-sounding names got far more callbacks. It was proof on paper of a truth he'd lived in his bones. And with it came a realization that tugged urgently. If bias is measurable, it can be engineered against if people decide to. Internships shuffled him through lobbies and badge readers. And the peculiar intimacy of conference rooms at 9 p.m., he watched how decisions happen when the agenda ends and the appetite for easy answers begins. How a room can mistake chemistry for competence. How an unstructured conversation, "Tell me about yourself," becomes a sieve that catches the familiar and lets new shapes slip through. He learned where the power sits and how it often doesn't. Know how much power it is. He graduated into a world that liked to publish glossy reports about representation while calling the same 5 names for the same 5 promotions. He took a job at a manufacturer where people still argued about whether scrap rates were a sign of sloppy processes or sloppy people. He went home to a 1-bedroom apartment with a good chair from a church rummage sale and a whiteboard big, enough to land a small plane on. He told himself quietly, fiercely, that he would build the thing he needed. Rooms that asked the right questions, in the right order, of everyone, not just the someones who looked like a memory of power. Building in Chicago was the kind of high that insists on its own rightness. The glass was so clean, it looked like an absence. Darius wore the suit he had saved for, sat on the lobby sofa upholstered in a fabric too confident to worry about stains, and reviewed his deck one more time. He had built a case study response that did not simply answer the company's question. It changed the question. He'd modeled a redesign for a cross-border distribution system that would cut lead times and reduce costs without crushing the people on the line. He believed in it. He believed, for once, that belief might be enough. A woman with a headset appeared, a smile that could rearrange a room. "They'll see you now," she said, as if adding, "This is your life." He followed her into a conference room with a view that made the highway below look like a ribbon on a gift. The man across the table stood. Mid-50s, expensive watch, the kind of posture that comes from being listened to for a long time. "Call me Tom," he said, and Darius did, though he would think of him later by his title Senior Vice President Operations, because intimacy without power can feel like a trick. They did the small talk weather, the Cubs, the nonsense that greases the gears. Then Tom gestured to the deck. "Walk me through your thinking." For 40 minutes, Darius did. He described a pilot that would reroute freight through a temporary hub-and-spoke system to stabilize service, while the upstream choke point was resolved. He explained how to resequence production without pretending workers were interchangeable parts. He acknowledged change management like a grown-up, neither trivializing it nor making it an excuse. He showed savings. He showed risk. He showed how to measure which was which. When he finished, Tom sat back, hands steepled. "Impressive," he said. "You're clearly very smart." Then his mouth rearranged itself into a different shape. "But culture fit matters here. Some places just aren't a fit." Darius stayed still. "What does fit look like in behavior and outcomes?" Tom smiled, a small smile with large implications. "You know it when you see it. Ease. Chemistry. This is a client-facing group. We need people who put senior clients at ease. Put at ease. Ease as a metric. Ease as a gate." Darius recognized the shape of the thought behind the thought. Not "you are not good," but "you are not like." He didn't argue. He asked, "Can we test fit in a structured way?" Ask every candidate the same questions tied to the actual job? Or use a work sample like an abbreviated version of this case to see how we think side by side? Tom's smile tightened. "You wouldn't believe how often we've tried to systematize this. In the end, it's about instinct. Instinct, the unstructured king. Instinct, which has faces and names and schools it prefers, and tells itself that preference is wisdom. Instinct, which sits beside a stack of research, showing that when we rely on it, we let bias run the meeting without even offering it coffee." They chatted a bit more. Tom thanked him for his time. The door closed softly, like a courtesy that arrives too late to protect anyone's dignity. The rejection email 2 days later could have been printed on stationery that said, "We say this a lot. You're an exceptional candidate, but we've decided to move forward with someone who more closely aligns with our culture." The anger arrived first clean and hot. The ache followed, a low, steady burn at the base of the heart. That night, Darius called his mother. He told her everything, from the clean glass to the dirty sentence. She listened the way nurses listen when the story is not just a diagnosis, but a life. "You did right," she said finally. "You asked to see the rules. They told you the rules were a feeling." He didn't sleep. He opened his laptop like it was a window and let the world blow in. He found what he already knew, but needed to see in black and white. Unstructured interviews are biased and unreliable. Structured interviews asking every candidate the same questions, scoring against anchored rubrics, are fairer and more predictive. Work samples beat charm. Evaluations that talk about chemistry and polish tend to mirror the evaluator's reflection. Standards of professionalism are often code for cultural conformity, policing hair, cadence, and clothing. More than competence. Potential becomes a trapdoor when it is used to excuse promoting those who look like leaders, while making those who don't wait for more proof. He also found language that made law from what his gut called wrong. National origin discrimination can include accent bias unless the accent materially interferes with performance. A real bar, not a vibe. The point wasn't that he had an accent. It was that there were rules on the books for some of this, not just courtesy guidelines. When policy is vague, bias thrives. When policy is concrete, people at least have to argue with the fact that they are breaking it. He printed out a page and taped it above his desk. If I ever sit where he sat, I will not make a feeling into a policy. The next day, he went to work. Not at Tom's company. Somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't yet deserve praise, but had a little less contempt for infrastructure and a little more curiosity about outcomes. He accepted what he could change, which was not nothing. He asked for one requisition to pilot a different way of hiring. He was not naive. He did not believe a policy saves a life. He believed a policy could stop a habit from pretending to be a rule. The pilot was small and ambitious in exactly the way experiments should be. One opening, one panel. Trained in how to ask every candidate the same questions tied directly to the work. One work sample scored with an anchored rubric. One attempt to blind names and addresses in the initial screen, so memories of schools and postal codes didn't do more speaking than the skills did. One post-mortem in which they would look not for someone to blame, but for a step to fix. Built it together. An HR partner who'd had enough of abstract ideals and wanted to ship something. A hiring manager burned by 2 boomerang hires. A line supervisor who knew what actually makes someone useful at 3 a.m. in February, when a conveyor belt hops its track. A junior analyst who asked questions out loud that everyone else had only asked themselves in the car. They found a conference room with a crooked-framed photo on the wall and spent a Tuesday afternoon writing the questions, then arguing about the questions and rewriting them until they were clear, relevant, and resistant to cleverness. The first candidate loved it. "I've never had an interview that respected my time like this," she said. The second stumbled on one question, then pointed to the rubric and said, "Give me 2 minutes. I can show you how I approach it." The panel watched, learned, and scored. The third candidate was charming and crisp and used jargon like seasoning. The work sample didn't land. Everyone saw it. The rubric held them to the seeing. They hired the second. She built a tool that shaved 3% off a stubborn logistics cost line within 6 months. Managers who had grumbled that the pilot was HR theater grumbled less. A few said the quiet part out loud. They liked this better. They felt less likely to accidentally do harm. They felt more likely to make the right call. Darius captured the metrics that matter to skeptics. Quality of hire, performance and retention at the 1-year mark ticked up. Time to hire ticked down slightly, because they spent less time debating vibes. Candidate satisfaction rose across the board. Panel confidence went up. He wrote it all down the way engineers write things when they want them to survive a reorg. Clear, repeatable, no heroics necessary. Not everyone clapped. The skeptics were not a villain. They were a variable. A senior manager tapped his chest and said, "I can tell in 2 minutes if someone has it." Darius smiled without contempt. 2 minutes can't predict the night shift, he said. Let's test your gut. If you're right, you'll win more often. If you're wrong, you'll thank your future self for the guardrails. He found allies in unexpected places, warehouse leads, who had been screened out of polished jobs, despite being the people who always knew what to do when polished plans cracked. Lawyers who learned that reducing discretion actually reduced legal risk. Finance people who discovered that process discipline shows up on the P&L. He recruited a small ad hoc group of mid-level managers across identity and function to tell him where the process wobbled. They did not flatter him. They told him when someone was recoding old habits under new names. They told him where candidates felt interrogated rather than invited to show their best work. They kept receipts. They turned into a conscience with CLIPBOARDS. Outside, the world heaved. Companies suddenly discovered the language of diversity in their press releases. Black squares appeared in feeds. Donations flowed. The people who had been injured by the old systems were asked to explain their injuries on panels at lunchtime. Some of it was sincere. Some of it was survival. Darius stopped measuring words and started counting budgets. He asked for training that treated bias literacy like safety training, recurring, practical, and tied to real consequences. He got some. He asked for a line item to expand the pilot. He got less than he wanted, more than he feared. Than the supply chain buckled. A global disruption choked a particular node. A client threatened to walk. Darius and 2 colleagues spent a weekend in a war room that looked like a kindergarten craft project gone feral. Post-its, printouts, the 4-digit code to the coffee machine scrawled on a whiteboard. They designed a stabilization plan that didn't pretend bodies were invisible. They executed with choreographed calm. The bleeding slowed. The client stayed. That win did something money cannot buy. It bought the right to be heard. He used it. He moved what had been a pilot into policy. Structured interviews became default, not novelty. Work samples became the rule whenever feasible. Panels were trained, not simply convened. Culture fit was retired as a euphemism and replaced with culture ad, defined in behaviors. Does this person challenge our blind spots? Does their experience extend our range? Can they do the work as it exists, not as a memory? Criteria changes mid-search. Had to be filed on a short form, not whispered in a hallway. If you wanted to add a requirement, say, a particular school or credential, you had to write down why it mattered to the job, not your nerves. He also built a humane escalation path for candidates. If you suspected the process you just experienced had deviated from the posted standard, you could request a review without torpedoing your chances at reapplying. It wasn't a court. It was a mirror. And it worked. People still rolled their eyes in private. But they also noticed something else. The hires got better. The arguments got shorter. The faint daily fatigue of participating in a process that hurt the wrong people got lighter. Culture did not change because someone said a sentence in an all hands. It changed because the hiring flow changed, and then the composition of rooms changed, and then conversations changed because the people in them had. The email arrived on a Thursday with the subject line that makes even seasoned hands sit up straighter. Interim appointment to VP Operations. The old guard had retired early. The shortlist had been curated the way shortlists often are. Tidy. Familiar. A high mirror quotient. But crises reorder logic. Darius had led the stabilization that kept a crucial client. He had improved metrics that the CFO and the KUU cared about in different registers. He had redesigned a process that reduced risk and increased performance. And he had managed to do it in a way that didn't make the company hate itself. Wanted a meeting with the board. In the glass-walled room that always feels colder than it should. The chair opened with no preamble. You have a promise and a problem, she said, her voice as steady as the horizon line on a calm day. You stabilized and improved operations. You've also been the face of changes some people call disruption. Convince us the disruption is a feature, not a bug. Darius had rehearsed for the wrong question. He smiled. Disruption moved us from a process that told a comfortable story to a process that tells the truth. The old way produced the outcomes. It produced slower time to hire, lower quality of hire variance, higher first-year attrition, and a leadership pipeline that looked like a family reunion. The changes are not cosmetic. They are operational. They reduce noise and improve signal. They make us harder to beat. A director known for plain speaking leaned forward. Some folks say you're hard on underperformers. I'm hard on systems that set people up to underperform, Darius said. We've published the standards. People know what earns the job. We give managers a real 30609 plan. We measure ramp. When people don't meet it, we fix a process. If a person still can't do the work, we say it out loud and we move. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. A third board member, eyes, thoughtful, asked the question that lives a floor below politics. What's the risk? Backsliding, he said. People relabel the old criteria. They start saying polish when they mean like me. They invoke client comfort to avoid the hard work of getting clients used to excellence in different wrappers. The only antidote is discipline that doesn't depend on me personally. Bake it into the flow. Tie it to how we train managers and how we evaluate them. And then, when it's boring, we will know it has worked. They didn't decide in the room. They never do. But 2 weeks later, he received a calendar invite for an announcement. He became the interim SVP, and then months later after metrics. And morale and margins behaved. The SVP, without the italicized adjective. On his first day with the new title, He did something both petty and profound. He called the man from Chicago. It wasn't revenge. It was an invitation to a reckoning without humiliation. "Tom," he said when the line connected, and the voice at the other end warmed as if old friends were catching up, which they were. "Not Darius," Tom said. "I've heard good things." "Come see it," Darius replied. "You once told me I wasn't a fit. We built a way to make fit mean able to do the work we actually need done. Fixed the hiring flow. Improved quality. Protected the company. You should see." Tom came. He walked the halls with the posture of someone expecting to be recognized by the walls. He watched 3 candidates answer the same questions and be scored against the same. Anchors. He watched a work sample where charm didn't carry a point. He watched a manager file a criteria change request and have to write a reason that made sense on paper. He watched a candidate press an escalation button and a trained reviewer show up in minutes. He watched a dashboard that didn't just show who applied, but where they dropped and why, and who made the decision at that moment. At the end of the day, Tom stood in the doorway with a look Darius recognized from his own face years earlier. A realization that your instincts have been defended by their outcomes, less than your outcomes have been defended by your instincts. "I'll say something I don't say often," Tom admitted. "We used fit as a way to avoid discomfort. It felt prudent. It was lazy. Now you can show the work," Darius said gently. "When the work is the standard, the face stops being the filter." They shook hands. It wasn't absolution. It was an acknowledgement that the chapter had turned, and that this particular book would not end with a flourish, but with a system that made better sentences possible. If you were looking for fireworks, year 1 would disappoint you. What it offered instead was something rarer, measurable change that felt less like a campaign and more like culture finding its bearings. Darius treated the new authority like a delicate instrument. He didn't swing it. He tuned with it. He audited the funnel and found the places where candidates quietly leaked out. He discovered that a particular middle manager used fit as a synonym for "went to my alma mater." He corrected it with conversation first, policy second. He discovered that one panelist's scores deviated wildly from everyone else's. He retrained, then rebalanced panels. He discovered that onboarding was treated as a handshake, not a handoff. He funded buddies, wrote clarity into the first 90 days, and measured managers on how well new hires ramped, not just how quickly. They filled a seat. He shifted performance reviews to include what he called transmission, who this person was making better, not just what they personally shipped out. He took the standard beyond hiring. Procurement got a new field in the RFP, how the vendors. Team composition and training practices would reduce risk and increase performance. Partners who wanted preferred status were given the playbook and told culture ad would be part of the score. Defined the same way, it was internally no magic words, only behaviors. Some balked, most adjusted. A few surprised everyone by improving. Faster than his own teams did, because it turned out changing a process is easier when you're not defending a decade of habit. He said yes when competitors called with cautious questions. It would have been satisfying to hoard the advantage. But the point had never been to be the best house in a broken neighborhood. The point was for fewer people to walk into lobbies and be told with a smile that they would not fit. Metrics accumulated in the way the best evidence does, quietly and persistently. Quality of hire continued to improve. First-year attrition dropped. Candidate experience scores rose, not just among candidates who got offers. Manager satisfaction increased, which surprised some of the skeptics most. The once-a-year internal survey stopped being a ritual for excusing the status quo and became a map for where to fix next. People noticed a softer thing, too. Meetings changed character when the people in them did. Debates became about trade-offs, not turf. "We've always done it that way," started to sound less like a winning argument and more like a confession no one wanted to be caught making. The word fit still appeared, but now it had to declare its meaning in public. And once it did it named a behavior. Instead of a feeling, it either stood or fell on merit. In the second year, he was invited to speak in a room with ceiling heights that make everyone aspirate when they enter. The invitation came from a conference organizer who had, coincidentally or not, once worked for Tom. The topic was talent and operations, but everyone knew what they really wanted. The story. He told it. He began at the kitchen table and ended at the dashboard. He refused to turn one man into a villain because villains make problems small. He insisted that what had happened in Chicago was not a moral failing unique to one person, but a system, doing what systems do when they are designed to prefer mirrors over windows. He explained structured interviews like a seatbelt, not a guarantee you won't crash, but a guarantee you won't be thrown through the windshield of your own impressions. At the end, in the Q&A, a woman in the third row mid-career tired in a way that didn't make her smaller stood and asked, "What do I do if I don't have your title?" "Pilot something," he said. "Find one step you can improve without permission. Make a manual. Show a metric. Invite someone into your experiment who is tired of being told to trust their gut when their gut has never had to explain itself. And when the thing works, write it down so the company can't pretend it was a miracle." In the lobby afterward, he watched a line of people who looked like the rooms he used to sit in, alone in the particular way a crowded place can make you feel. They told him their versions of the story. He took them seriously. He took notes. He handed over his email address and meant it. He also took a call he had not expected, a board member from his old near employer. They were losing ground. They wanted to stop printing posters and start changing flow. Would he consult? He said yes with one condition. Their CEO had to sit through the training with everyone else. The call went quiet and then came back with the word he had been waiting to hear since he sat across from Tom in a glass room a lifetime ago. Yes, when a white executive once told Darius he would never fit, he believed he was talking about a young man's temperament and a company's temperament. Disagreeing. He was wrong. He was talking about a system, who it was built for, who it would make comfortable, who it would protect from surprise, and who it would require to contort. The most satisfying part of this story is not that the young man proved the executive wrong by becoming what old rooms finally had to admit was leadership. It's that he used his seat to make the sentence itself lose power. 3 lessons survive the meetings and the metrics. First, bias is not only a moral issue, it is an operational issue. When you hire for familiarity, you perform like a club, not a company, and clubs lose to companies every time the world changes. Second, fairness is a process, not a press release. Structured interviews, anchored rubrics, real work samples, practical training, and clear accountability are not philosophical stances. They are tools. Use them. Third, representation without redesign is decoration. Without changing the machinery, you will keep producing the same pictures and then argue about lighting. If you are the person with the pen over the requisition, write the standard down and stick to it when the room gets restless. If you are the person waiting in the lobby, remember that your excellence is not a favor you hope someone will extend. It is a fact you carry. If you are the person who once said, with a smile, that someone wouldn't fit, take the tour. Watch the work. Let the instinct that got you this far be replaced with a discipline that will take your company the rest of the way. Darius kept the rejection email, not as a trophy, but as a control. A reminder of what happens when feeling becomes policy. And a proof that when policy becomes fairness, the next person's walk from the lobby to the conference room, it's a little shorter, a little lighter, and a lot more honest.